I allow other people to talk too much, and I just need to reserve more of that time for me if I want to get through these notes. But on the other hand,
then there's the question, what happens if we don't quite get through it?
well, if we don't quite get through the Psalms, I looked at the number of Psalms. I've thought about this, because this is a real danger. We're going to get up here to Psalm 18 in a couple of weeks. 50 verses in Psalm 18. So I know, I'm not getting through 50 verses. We're just going to move on. So some of these we may be hitting highlights. Now, will I make an exception for something like, yes, Psalm 119? Probably, but that is at least a couple years in the future at the moment. So I'm going to cross that bridge when and if I get to it. Who knows? The Lord may come back before I get to Psalm 119. So we'll just deal with that when we get there. But before we begin, before I get too carried away with the sound of my own voice, we'll say a quick prayer and then we'll read Psalm 16. So, Father in heaven, we thank you for this day. We are grateful to you for the world that you have made, for the church that is here in Marysville, for this opportunity for us to meet together, for us to read from your word, for us to think on it, to consider it, to discuss it with one another. We ask that you would make this time profitable to us in terms of the wisdom that we can glean from it, that we may better know you, better know your word itself and your will for our lives through it, so that we can serve you and bring you the glory and the honor that you deserve. We are thankful, Father, for this time, this opportunity, this word that you have given us, but we are most grateful, Father, that you sent your living word, your Son, to this world to be a sacrifice for us, to redeem us, and we pray these things in your Son's name. All right, Psalm 16. So this one, as we were just saying, they start getting longer here over the next several Psalms. So last week, 5 verses. This week, 11. Next week, 15. And then we make a big jump up to 50. So I do intend, even if we don't actively discuss every single verse, I do intend that even with the longer Psalms, where, if at all possible, again, some may be an exception to this, it's very, very extreme end, but to read through the entire thing. This gets back to kind of a theme that I go on about when discussing the epistles and things like that, that these were originally written as a whole, right? That those books and those letters were written as an entirety, and it is important where and when possible to step back and to understand not just the individual trees in the metaphor, of course, but the forest itself and what is the big picture. And with the Psalms, I think the same thing applies. While it's certainly useful and very profitable to look at them narrowly and to see the verses and to discuss specific points in them, these were written as more complete things, as songs or poems, thoughts that are longer than just 1 or 2 verses in most cases. And so reading through them as a whole and trying to feel and experience them that way as a flowing entirety, it can be important for more fully understanding them. So, Psalm 16, a Miktam of David. Preserve me, O God, for in you I take refuge. I have said to Yahweh, you are my Lord, I have no good beyond you. As for the saints who are on the earth, and the excellent in whom was all my delight, let their sorrows be multiplied, another they have espoused. Their drink offerings of blood I will not offer, nor take their names upon my lips. Yahweh is the portion of my inheritance and of my cup. You maintain my lot. The lines have fallen to me in pleasant places. Yea, I have a goodly heritage. I will bless Yahweh, who has given me counsel. Yea, my heart instructs me in the night seasons. I have set Yahweh always before me, because he is at my right hand, I shall not be moved. Therefore, my heart is glad, and my glory rejoices. My flesh also shall dwell in safety, for you will not leave my soul to Sheol, neither will you suffer your Holy One to see corruption. You will show me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. In your right hand there are pleasures forevermore. All right. So this is the first time we've had a psalm labeled a Miktam. What could that be?
The footnote says an atonement.
Okay, an atonement. So a lot of these footnotes and things that we get as a suggestion of this could be this could be that, come from words that are not fully or clearly understood, and therefore they try and relate them to words that are similar or have a similar root. So in the same way that in English you could take a longer word and say, well, it's composed of or has roots in these shorter words that we do know and understand better, here's how you can extrapolate to a meaning. But just as in English, just because something is connected to another word doesn't mean that it has or maintains all the characteristics of that shorter word. Right? So we do have to be careful, but yes, there's one possibility. I have a translation that calls this a contemplative poem. The implication, in most people's opinion, is this is some sort of term, musical or literary, again, describing the psalm. Now, that's a fairly basic and easy assumption, right? In the titles or at the beginnings of psalms, you have words that describe them, the words that we don't understand. What are they probably talking about? Musical or literary things. That kind of follows. But it is something of an assumption what some of these mean. We'll see next week if we look at ahead a little bit. At the top of 17, it says it's a prayer of David. And then Psalm 18 has one of the longer introductions. If we look at that one, for the director of music of David, the servant of the Lord, he sang to the Lord the words of this song, and the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul, he said. And so we have these preambles that are interesting sometimes to contemplate or think about, but I don't know that I would classify these headings in the same way that I would the content. Do any of them have things to say that are essential in some way to the message of God's word or the gospel? I can't think of any off the top of my head, rather than as explanatory notes, perhaps of the circumstances, of the authorship. I'm not sure. I don't know if anybody else has anything that occurs to them where a psalm's preamble has theological significance. Interestingly, this may be one of the few that would, except for the fact that the Miktam part of it is not actually part of it. But we'll get to that, hopefully, before we run out of time. That comes up a little bit later as well. There we go. So what is the psalm about? What is the author, what is the psalmist trying to say in this psalm?
Faith that he has in his Lord.
Okay, he's speaking about his faith in God, certainly. Yes? Not
Not letting any other idols come before God.
Yes, not letting idols come before God. Again, related concepts. So he progresses through these, right, by talking about, in a broad sense, his faith in God and the different aspects of that. He will not let other gods interfere with this. He's not going to let his circumstances interfere with this. And then at the end, he kind of concludes by wrapping up by talking about the outcomes or his expectation of continuing faith in God and what that will mean for him. So it is, yes, about his faith in God and then in specific kinds of ways as he progresses through the psalm. So most translations alter the original language in verse 2 for clarity and for meaning. Now, when I say this, some of you may have in here, and both of my translations, unfortunately, that I brought with me, I think the ASV, let me back up to Psalm 2, or verse 2, I should say, does this. This is why I didn't worry about having it with me. There we are. O my soul, thou hast said unto Jehovah. Now, I don't know if anybody's got one in their hand. The NIV says, I said to the Lord. I believe the ESV says this. The New King James says this. The version that I have here, the literary version that's based on the ASV, but has been, some of the language has just been updated to more modern terms. It gets rid of the haths. It also uses, I have said to Yahweh. O my soul does not appear in the original. And it is implied here because of that next word, here rendered thou, which is the second person pronoun. We would say you. It literally begins this line, you have said unto God, or you have said unto Yahweh or Jehovah, right, the Lord, usually how that's translated. You have said. But that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Keep me safe, O God, for in you I take refuge. Then it goes on, you have said to the Lord, you are my Lord. Who is he talking to? Becomes the question. And so what most people believe, most people who translate, and you see this by its prevalence in most translations, again, for clarity and for understanding, that as he's going along, this continues to be the psalmist speaking from his own perspective. And he, the psalmist, is speaking to God in a prayer, in a kind of a worshipful kind of way. So this way of putting this in here, and the reason that people insert, "Oh my soul," is because there is that word, we've talked about it in past weeks, where in the Hebrew, this was a way of referring to yourself, right? There's the word that means soul that also means my own person, my identity, and when I'm thinking of who I am, it's also the same word for soul. So they insert this in to make, again, hopefully clearer that it is, again, still the psalmist speaking of himself. This is the way that they understand this verse. It is a little bit of a difficult verse because of the pronoun shift, right? It goes from being first person, I do this, I am that, to being second person, you, just for one verse, right? If we go down to the next first person pronoun, verse 4, he's already switched back. I will not pour out. So the you kind of makes it a little bit, I don't want to say complicated or tricky, but it is different. Why would this sort of thing happen? Why would the original author shift one line this way?
Break the concentration.
Okay? That's a very good reason sometimes to get someone's attention, right? To break things up and say, are you paying attention? Right? If you make something a little more difficult to understand, it can be a little bit easier to pay attention to, oddly enough, right? We can get bored with things that are too easy, right? Children's movies, for example, how well do they hold your attention now, right? Or children's music. It's just not that engaging, right? You know what's coming, you understand the tune, it's just and it's easy to tune out. A little complication can make things more engaging, more interesting, but it can also just sound better, right? We're reading this in translation, and the way that we hear the flow of the words and our aesthetic understanding of how poetry and song works is not the same. And we talked about this a little bit at the very, very beginning of the very first class, that in Hebrew, they liked alliteration far more than we do, right? A repetition of the first sound in a sentence. And so, even if that specifically, alliteration, is not what's happening here, their sense of aesthetics is different from ours. And so, if you can put in a poetic construction, right, by switching it up in a way that your audience, if they're paying attention closely, will grasp and understand, appreciate the way that you're being artful about it, it's a good enough reason to do that, even if it ends up making this a little difficult for us, thousands of years later, trying to understand this in a different language over time. I don't think that there's really a lot of disagreement about the meaning of this. As I say, when you review, you can go on to, I use Bible Gateway, I think is the name of the website, and there's, 40, 50 English translations that you can all compare to each other. And I would say probably 80 to 90% of them just go ahead and say, I said to the Lord. There's only a couple, and they tend to be very early, and they tend to be the most literal. Those two things, they're always the same. Like King James and the original ASV, that have the insert for clarity and then retain the second person pronoun. All right, that's probably enough language for today. But the second line of this also becomes then complicated. He literally says, my good, not beyond you. Right? Again, the NIV says, apart from you, I have no good thing. Right? The ASV kind of retains a little bit more of this, I have no good that is beyond you. But it's not, again, as clear as we would necessarily have it in English. Some of these lines in this, we're going to see this again in verse 3, can be a little bit difficult. But it does appear clear that he is speaking to the Lord, right? Even though it's not strictly speaking a pronoun, he shifts here, my good, right? This is in the person who is speaking, but as the author, it's easy to understand this as being himself. All right. I don't want to rush on, but there's so much in this. Verse 3 also has its own set of complications. The they that we have in this, right? So if I'm reading this from the NIV for a little bit of clarity. As for the saints who are in the land, they are the glorious ones in whom is all my delight. There are different ways that this can be understood as well, because the they is actually not in the second line. It's at the end of the first line. And so it's possible to think about this as being a little bit differently. Do I have it the next line? Yeah. So I'm just going to throw that up here. The first line then could simply be using the they to encompass or broaden the spectrum of who these saints are and where they are. Right? As for the saints in the land, they, or as for all of these people, right? Putting it at the end of the first line could just be a way of encompassing their fullness. And then the second line then becomes, again, more literally, excellent of all my delight in them. There's an alternate reading in my footnote in my NIV referring to that this may end up being more connected to verse 4, making these not good people, but people that are now the pagans. Right? That these people are chasing after or seeking excellence in places they ought not to be. Right? Where does this break come in ideas? Where we are talking about those that trust in God and the shift to those who do not. Because it clearly occurs here, right? By the time we get to verse 4, the author is saying at the end of it, I will not have anything to do with these. I will not even speak their names. And in verse 2, we have the person saying, you are my God. Apart from you, I have nothing that is good. So verse 3 is a real challenge for translation. I don't think that you can necessarily end up in a theological quandary, picking one direction to go or the other. It is an interesting thing to contemplate, because you can then contemplate this going both directions, right? What to think about when the world, when everyone around you, when those that are supposed to be set apart are now seeking after that which is not to be sought after, who are deceived or who are drawn away, or at the same time, in a place where you have fellowship, right? You are connected to everyone else in your area, in your land, in your place, who are also with you in seeking after God. Both of these ideas are worth thinking about in their own way. All right, I'm going to stop here for a minute. I've been monologuing for an awful long time. Anything in these first 3 verses that I rushed past, glossed over, I don't want to give anybody or cut anybody off before they have a chance to. Okay, that's fine. I can keep going. Yeah,
I'm going to just make a...
please.
On 1 through 3 kind of describes really a paradigm of the importance of our whole time down here on this earth. Is God is there. We derive everything that's good from Him. One thought that goes through my mind a lot is I don't really want to find myself hanging out with a lot of people that don't subscribe to the teachings of God, if they worship some other God. I really, you have to interact with people, but I don't really feel like I want to pursue relationships
Yeah.
And that is the story of really what we're doing here, what I'm doing on a daily basis. It kind of just tells the whole thing right there in 3 verses.
Yeah, it is that that tension, right, that the New Testament also gets at, described by saying that we are in the world, but we must not be of the world. That we are in some measure forced to interact with those that are outside of the church. And that while we do so, we must be a beacon of light, but we cannot be seen to be associated with them so closely that we are thought to be one of them. Yeah. That we need to maintain the association within the church. Yeah.
You know, those inner feelings that you gotta have that you don't necessarily advertise, say them all the time. These types of feelings are there a lot.
Sure, sure. I mean, there's definitely a reason that the church is referred to as a family, right? That there are things that are, levels of kind of openness with the world that vary depending on your relationship with people, right? That, forgive me for this, this is just sort of kind of off the top of my head a little bit because I hadn't planned this necessarily, but the relationship with Christ, between Christ and the church, is described as the closest one, right? That of a bride and a groom, a marriage relationship, right? The idea of, again, when we get back to Genesis, one flesh, the closest relationship that we have is with God. But then the next one, right, the family relationship, brothers and sisters, right, or parents, we're given that description, both parents with God the Father, but the family relationship within the church. And that there is a difference in the relationship that we are supposed to have, the closeness, right? The willingness of ourselves to sacrifice for others between us, excuse me, and our brethren here, and then us and the world, right? It's not that we don't care or we don't love the world, but they are not of the church. And they have to be treated with a measure of cautiousness because we cannot always trust them and their motives and their actions. In the same way that we are supposed to be able to trust people within the church, right? That those relationships are different. I don't want to get too far off on that tangent, but that's fine. Yeah.
So, I don't hang out with the most holiest people,
Sure.
but I try and be that beacon of light, even when I'm amongst crowds that are believe completely different than I do. But isn't that what we're supposed to do? Aren't we supposed to do our best, even if other people have ill intentions? If we keep our faith and we believe, and why does it matter what other people perceive us as if we're doing the right thing? Shouldn't it be more? Shouldn't it be what God thinks of us rather than what people think of us?
It is certainly. And this is why I describe this as being a thing in tension, right? Because we do have to be in the world. There's no escaping it. We live in the world, and it is a fallen world, and there are evil people and evil things in it. And I think we lose sight sometimes that, well, the world as it was in the time of, say, the New Testament, right, the Roman and Greek world, was different in some ways that are easier than it is now. They did not have the pervasiveness of electronic media, right? The government, though it was more oppressive in what it would do to you, was willing to do to you, was certainly a lot easier to evade in other ways, right? No one took your fingerprints. No one could take your photograph. You could move to another city, call yourself by a new name, and you could disappear a lot easier than you could do nowadays, right? So avoiding government oppression in some ways was simpler. On the other hand, you probably had to walk to whatever the next city was. There were no planes, there were no cars, there were no, boats. You were dependent on the wind. So there were different sets of challenges, and it's always been thus. But at the same time, they didn't have maybe saying the same philosophical struggles with the idea of truth or the malleable nature of a person's identity, right? That I can just be whoever I imagine myself to be, as accepted as a truth. But on the other hand, temple prostitution was a thing in the Greek and the Roman world, right? If you're walking your kid down the street, the chance of you encountering somebody in a state of undress who is offering sexual services to all and sundry walking by, much higher than it is today. I don't worry about that in Marysville. But in any major city in the ancient world, that was a thing you could encounter anywhere on the street. A completely different world in which you had to inhabit. But the principles then and now are the same, right? That we must navigate this world as best we can, that we must be that beacon of light, we must be salty, right? Jesus says if you lose that distinctiveness, that saltiness that you have, you're worthless, right? Salt that loses its saltiness is worthless. We must maintain that while also retaining that separate identity. So it's not so much that we cannot ever associate with those outside the church, or that us being in the company of others, or even being in some sort of a business association is bad, or some other association. But what we must never lose in the eyes of the world, as far as we are able, is that distinctiveness, that we are different, right? Right? That we all may be supporters of the same sports team, right? Whoever you happen to be, right? I got to be careful. If they're going to put me on the internet, I might pick the wrong team and get somebody mad. But, you know, my parents are listening from Tuscaloosa. They're going to be all fired up about that. They're not really fired up about the University of Alabama. But the potential is there, right? The idea being, though, that even if it's like, all right, yes, we are all in favor of this, that when it comes to other questions, we still stand out. Right? Like, go Mariners, but everybody understands how I feel because they know who I am when it comes to talking about Mariners doing a Pride night. Right? I'm happy to see the Mariners get into the playoffs, be in first place, hopefully they get into the playoffs, but there's still a clear disassociation of myself from the things that they support wholeheartedly as an entire organization or corporately. Right? That when you are with those people, whether from work or from some other association that are not necessarily in the church, they still know who we are, right? And that some other Christian looking in from the outside can also see who we are, right? That we maintain our identity as children of God wherever we go and find ourselves. I'm really getting off topic. This is fine. This is fine. This is the fun part about class is when you ask for questions, you can chase rabbits wherever they end up taking you. So. All right, I'm gonna see if we can get through more than 4 or 5 verses. But what is a saint? When speaking of saints in verse 3, what does that mean?
The New Testament Christian is certainly a member of Christ's church.
Mm-hmm.
You don't hear of saint used in the Old Testament very much.
Not as often. You don't see the word used. It's a translation of a particular concept. Because it actually has a specific English meaning, the word saint. And it's not the one that Roman Catholics use, necessarily, though theirs is derived essentially from the very basic English meaning. It's a person who is set apart. Literally holy. Holy is what that means. It is to be set apart for God. Those that are apart from everything, which gets right back into what we were just talking about. Those that are different, which is why, again, it works, it applies in Psalms when the author is talking about the people of Israel. Because what was Israel? They were the which people? The chosen people, right? God chose them and took them out of the world, in a sense, in order to make them the nation through whom his Messiah would come. They were holy. They were set apart, chosen. They were saints. In the same way that we now think of ourselves, in the context of the New Testament description, as saints. We're different. We're different from the rest of the world. We have put our faith in Christ. We are holy and set apart. We are removed for a higher purpose and dedicated to God. Saints. Verse 4 is a lot of fun for linguistic reasons, so I will not dwell on this a lot. The running after other gods. The sorrows of those will increase. There's The words here, the hasten, can also be, the root is also possible to understand as being related to bartering or buying something. So this looks like a little bit of a linguistic play on words to a degree. That you can understand this as someone who is either running after other gods or someone who is attempting to buy the favor of other gods, right? To purchase or to make a deal with another god. And because, again, the word can go either way, you'll see different translations will use different terms for this.
Libations.
Not libations, it's in the line before that, actually. Those who run after, hasten, or pursue other gods. Most translations, I think, go with hasten, but some use barter, buy, or bargain with other gods.
Those who run after other gods.
Yeah, run after. So most translations go with the hasten concept. But again, it's possible to understand that the other way. The root is related. Again, it comes down to like it's not a diacritical remark, I don't think, but the way that they mark the consonants in Hebrew to show which vowel goes with it. It's essentially a one-letter difference, in a sense, between these two words. So, but a libation, a drink offering, yeah, it's the way that you would pour something out instead of, as a sacrifice, instead of using whatever it is, you put it on the altar to be destroyed or unused, right? It becomes a sacrifice in that way. The word God or gods in the first part of 4 is also implied. It is not actually present in the text. It's implicit, not explicit. But it is implied by what is said in the second half, and then the contrast with speaking of the Lord. The second half of verse 4, he won't even speak their names. This has to do as well largely with what those names could mean. The word Baal, literally means a lord. So the very names of those gods, or speaking them, is almost implicating you in a belief in them to a degree, right? That they had those names, and the psalmist's refusal to even speak their names is probably related to this concept. That you would not even call them by their proper names in order to avoid any appearance even of going after or worshiping or pursuing them. The other example that I had when I was looking these up, Molech literally means king. And so refusing to even speak the name of a false god to avoid any appearance of following after. So we have two metaphors. All right. Got into verse 5. We're almost halfway by the end of class. The inheritance and the cup. Why are these metaphors here? Metaphors of an inheritance and a cup. What would an inheritance mean to the children of Israel? The promised land, specifically. This was the big inheritance that they had thought of and focused on for much of their history, and that was a kind of a constant reminder. Where you dwell is the inheritance that God has granted to Abraham and his ancestors. This is now your land. Yeah. And this will tie in, right, in the next verse where he talks about the lines, right? That the land was divided up. The lines have fallen in pleasant places, he says. The places that I have been given, the boundaries of my land, the NIV actually has boundary lines to make it more explicit, are pleasant things. His inheritance from God is a good one. Right? That which we've inherited. But did everyone receive an inheritance in the land? It's a little bit of a trick question. Right? Have you ever seen those maps? I've got one at the end of my Bible. I don't have one in my notes, where they show you where each of the tribes of Israel was assigned. Is everyone on there? The Levites. Yes, the Levites did not have a land inheritance. What did they have as their inheritance? The priesthood, the temple, serving God. And so again, the idea of inheritance here, speaking of the lines of the land and the boundaries in a figurative way, serving God and being close to God can be an inheritance as well, right? That he talks about the boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Surely I have a delightful inheritance. Even as a figurative metaphor, this works even better. Because he has been talking about serving God, being close to the Lord, and then he goes on further in 7 and 8 to continue to talk about serving and praising God, receiving blessings from him. The true inheritance for one who serves God is not actually, in fact, physical things. It is the blessings and benefits that come from being someone who reveres and obeys God. All right, I really have to hurry up. I'm near the end of my time. Cup, of course, we know this is a strong metaphor for people who are Jewish or Hebrew. Jesus talks about this, right? It is your destiny, that which is given to you, that which you must have, right? Jesus in the garden prays, if at all possible, let this cup pass from me, right? That this is what God has ordained for him, and that is what he must have. We must drink the cup we are given. And so when he speaks of this, that God has given him the cup to drink, he is trusting in God to give him that which is good and right and proper for him. Right? Not just in a very specific, narrow sense of drink even, but within the entire circle of his life. All right, I'm going to run through all this. Signified by cup, I just have lines in 6. Israelites, yes. Satisfaction. The word heart, in most translations, literally the word is kidneys, which is frequently the organ used for your conscience. Future expectation. There's so much stuff good here. Why is God on his right hand? This is your undefended spot in a battle, right? Traditionally, you carry the shield on your left, your sword on your right, and you are very, very dependent on whoever stands to your right hand to help keep you safe, right? So the idea of having God as your right hand or on your right hand is a powerful metaphor for security. Okay, so then in verse 10, God is not abandoning us, right? Not in this life or the next. He talks about this, and this is the verse that gets cited in Acts. In Acts 13, verse 35, if I remember my citation correctly, it's in one of these notes, but apparently it's the next one or the one after that. I'm going to flip ahead. Paul is speaking and talking about Jesus. So I'm just going to start Acts 13:32. We tell you the good news. What God promised our fathers, he has fulfilled for us, their children, by raising up Jesus. As it is written in the 2nd Psalm, you are my son, today I have become your father. The fact that God raised him from the dead, never to decay, is stated in these words, I will give you the holy and sure blessings promised to David. So it is stated elsewhere, you will not let your Holy One's seed decay. For when David had served God's purpose, this is now 36, David served God's purpose in his own generation. He fell asleep, he was buried with his fathers, and his body decayed. But the one whom God raised from the dead did not see decay. I'm going to talk about authorship when we got to this point as well. This is a strong case, right, that Paul is arguing David wrote this, and that this line here, which he is citing, you will not let your Holy One's seed decay, is a reference to Christ, a prophetic prefiguring of who Jesus is. But there's also, well, I'm really running over my time. You're going to hopefully forgive me for this. That this is a prefiguring of the gospel message for us as well, right? That we, as the psalmist, as David writing here, put our faith in God, and then we have this confidence that God cares for us, not just now and here, in this moment, as I live, as I stand before you, but at the time that we suffer our greatest need of him. When we come to the time of dying, right? That David's confidence here is that God is not going to abandon him. Not now as he lives, not later when he dies. That his body is not wholly abandoned. that God's protection, that God's faithfulness to us extends beyond our own lifetimes. And we see this fulfilled fully with the coming of Christ, his conquering of death, and our ability to share in those blessings through him, through his blood and our faith in him. That we are not abandoned by God. Not now, not ever. And as we go on into the next life, God will continue to love, to care, and to protect us. To care for us and protect us. All right. I ran past my time, at least according to the clock on the back of the wall. So, I think that was going to be the last. Yeah, I put Romans in there as well, right? About nothing will separate us. Height, depth, nothing. So, anything else? I know it was a whirlwind on those last 6 verses. I really wanted to get to 10. I had to get to 10. Okay, well, you're very kind to put up with me running long. That does not augur well for Psalm 17, which has got another 4 verses in it, but we'll do our best next week when we get there. Thank you again. I appreciate your time and your attention. Thanks.